Greetings all, welcome to another session here of Tuesday Talks. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the history of English. We're going to be moving into Old English, and we'll talk a little bit about the invasion, the conversion to Christianity, and some of the other historical events, as well as how it impacted the English that existed and how it transitioned into what we now call Old English. I want to also get into the Benedictine Reform and the conquest of language in transition, but that's going to happen probably in another video series, so you'll just have to hang on for that one. Let's jump right in and take a little look over some of the epochs, the eras that occur for English. From 450 to about 1100 is what we would call Old English. It's a style of writing that you're not going to be able to read if you're a standard English reader. You're going to look at it and you're going to say, I know a lot of these letters, but I can't read any of this. So when we talk about Shakespeare, for example, we're not talking about Old English. This would be more like in line with Beowulf, and eventually we'll talk a little bit about Alfred the Great as well, the great military man and educator. From Old English, we hit a very important event that triggers introduction into Middle English, and there's a lot of influx from outside sources, particularly France. This is the life of Chaucer is also in these 500 years, so you'll be able to study a little bit about, for example, Canterbury Tales. And then we'll move into the 1500s, or what we call early modern English. This is what we typically will look at when we see Shakespeare. This stuff we can basically read. There are a couple words and maybe a couple letters every now and again that we're not quite sure what that is, but we can read it. We can basically understand what's going on. Basically. And then from 1650 or the early 1700s to the present is what we would call modern English. Things have become more standardized. Things have become more regimented. And so those are the four basic eras or epochs for English. You'll want to know those at some point in the future. Let's jump into this Old English, or kind of pre-Old English introduction here. Old English has a very limited base of knowledge, base of writings. Stuff that could have been written but just doesn't exist anymore. There are very few pieces that are out there. There are pieces that are out there, and they do try to piece them together. Again, they estimate that the time frame for this is somewhere between 450 AD to 1150. It had a lot of influence by the Celts, the Celtic language that was there, also the Norse coming up from the north, and then there was a Latin influence from the Romans, and German influence from the Germans and Scandinavians that came in from the mainland. So there's an amalgamation here of languages that are going on in the play. Again, the Celtic is probably the more foundational, but because of the German influence of all these groups that were moving in, there's a great influence of Germanic language. In fact, by the time we get to Old English, it is at its foundation now more Germanic than anything. It's a synthetic language, and what that means is that it has lots of different inflections and cases and gender. Anybody who's ever studied German, you know there's 7 ways to say the, because there are all these different cases. Modern English doesn't have them today. We'll look at that in just a little bit. The Old English era includes a lot of changes. There are a lot of transitions that happen during these 6 centuries, these 500 years. And the changes are linguistically, the changes are cultural, the changes are political. So there are a lot of things that are going on here. Some of the major elements that happened during this time include the German invasion. Venerable Bede will say there was this invasion by about 449. But when you study the actual history of what happened, when you study the actual documents that we have, again, we don't have many of them. A lot of historians will probably disagree and not call it an invasion of sorts. It wasn't a huge military conquest type of invasion. It was more of a groups moving into this open new land that they found, and they'd like to create a settlement type of thing. There weren't necessarily wars going on during this time. So it was more complex. It took longer. It took a number of decades for these people groups to be moving in. The ways that they discovered this is that as they discovered and read documents that were very old, they would begin to see dialects and they would begin to see spelling differences, and they could, start to list these out, place these out on a map and say, okay, here are these differences and here are the influences that are coming with these. They also got to see how writing evolved over time because of cultural interaction. For example, we have new words that have entered into English because of where we were, or because we didn't have a word for it, and then a new word entered. We took it from another language. We took it from that cultural interchange. And so we see some changes like that. We also see some vowels that kind of smooth out. They become less distinct. I encourage you, if you've never done so, do a study on dialects in the United States. And you'll note that on the East Coast, there are a lot of different dialects. And as you move west, further west, you begin to see these dialects begin to merge or become less frequent, less noticeable. There are fewer dialects as you move west. That's because of this melding that has occurred. And that's what they see in this old period, again, 450 to 1100 AD. They see this mix of languages and smoothing of language because of the cultural interchange. One of the earliest pieces of Old English that is written down is entitled the Cadmean Hymn. He was an Old English herdsman and a poet, and he had some poetic ideas and poetic devices that he used. And so this is what the Cadmean Hymn would look like. And this has been kind of, what's the word here? Made easier to read for us. They put it into more Roman script instead of probably the earlier type. But even as you look at this, and you say, I can't read any of this. Nuskulion, Herion, Hefon Reis, weird. I don't know what any of these words mean. I don't know if I'm pronouncing them properly. But this is the type of thing that's going on way back when. And this is a piece of evidence that we have that supports Old English and the place that it had when it was there in that time frame. When you look at the island, you'll see that there are four main dialects. They're Mercian, Northumbrian, Kentish, and West Saxon. The Mercian and the Northumbrian areas were eventually conquered by Vikings. So if you look at a map like this here, you see Mercian here. Here you see Kentish. I'm sorry, East Saxon. Here you see Kentish down here. And this is basically where the quote-unquote main English source is going to be. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of influence. But this is the focal point for a lot of English. Again, Mercia and Northumbrian were taken over by Vikings eventually, and they tried to take over the whole island. We'll talk about that in a little later. But so you have these dialects that are going on here. You have the Celtic dialects that are going on over here, and this whole section eventually gets taken over by one area, and that's going to be the English. The English and the Scots eventually get together, at least politically, years later, but there is still a separation. There's still a separation. So we've got those four dialects, okay? Mercian, Northumbrian, Kentish, and West Saxon. Later on, you're going to see even more dialects, but for now, those are the main ones. Okay, enter Augustine, who is a monk. In 597, he is sent by the Pope, Gregory I, to go and spread Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons. The story is told that Gregory I actually meets some children who are from the island, and so the Pope says he wants to send some missionaries there to teach them about Christianity. And one of the primary people who goes is Augustine. Before the Pope sent anybody, if you recall, the Romans were there for many years, but eventually the Romans left. However, when the Romans were there, they brought Christianity. There is evidence to indicate that while they were there, they brought Christianity, and they brought it, and there were some locals who had embraced Christianity. Now, a little after the 400s, the Romans leave, and a lot of the pagan ideas eventually return, but there was still evidence of Christianity there, even prior to Augustine. But that's what Augustine walks into. Now, it's interesting that it was dangerous. You'll see that there were a variety of kingdoms, as we saw in this little picture here, right? You have a variety of little kingdoms all over here, and what happens is that King Ethelbert, who is of the kingdom of the Kents, he invites, or he allows Augustine to come here, and he protects him. And one of the reasons is because King Ethelbert marries a Christian woman from France, Princess Bertha, and the king eventually converts. And so it's through the king that this entrance into the island begins, and then Augustine begins setting up monasteries. And the monasteries were mainly schools, places where people could come and learn and study, and where they could share Christianity, and were also where they could help out the communities. So through Princess Bertha, King Alfred becomes a Christian, and a lot of other converts in the Kent area and other kingdoms become Christian. So it begins to trickle down as you go. Augustine becomes the archbishop of this area eventually. He forges into this area, and he wins that honor. So, again, as I say, he comes in down here, okay? But eventually, a whole bunch of areas in here in particular where he begins to establish monasteries and schools. Again, you'll note that this area is more controlled by Celtic regions, and this area is more controlled by Vikings, okay? But still, Augustine's allowed to move into some of these areas and brings his message, brings his monasteries, and begins to spread Christianity. Now, this has another effect of also spreading English. Bear in mind, it's coming from down here. Okay, so this is going to be the primary language that's going to spread to the others. Not that the other languages don't have any influence, but they're going to be spreading to the others. In addition to the transition into Christianity, there's also the transition into a different language. The Anglo-Saxons, taking a lot of inference from the Norse, from the Vikings, had runes for language, characters. And what happens is these runes are now going to be replaced with more Latin-based characters. And so we're going to see a transition. Here are the Anglo-Saxon runes, okay, and some of them can be used, but some of them can't. And so they're going to have to replace some, they're going to have to take some that they can, and so it shifts their language. I don't know about you, but can you imagine all of a sudden we're going to be adding new letters to the alphabet? We're going to be taking certain letters out of the alphabet because of some influence, and that's what happened here. So this language, which is now very runic, is going to be replaced. We're going to start to have a mix between these two different languages. So it's an odd transition out of runic writing into more alphabetic style of writing. The monks bring the Roman alphabet. Okay, some are transferred, some are added, some are dropped. Okay, and again, it has a tremendous impact on the English language. The way we read now is going to change. A couple other cultures have had this experience, but it's interesting to see that there's this big change in the English language, and I'm assuming that many of you never knew that before, right? All right, about 300 years after Augustine, you have this spread of Christianity, you have the spread of language, you have the spread of Old English into bigger areas, and when King Alfred is king of the Kents, there is a war, and during the war, the Vikings try to take over. And Alfred fights back the Vikings, and he barely wins. I mean, there were a couple of times that people thought that they were not going to win, and so he was the great king because he saved England from being taken over by the Vikings. So he fights back the Vikings, and he forces them to retreat to France, and the northern parts of Northumbria. So they go north. Okay, the Vikings had attacked the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons, and he nearly wiped them out. And so the group that goes to France, the place that they go to, is now renamed or started to be called um, Normandy, because the Vikings were Normans. Okay, so the Vikings, the people in Normandy, really weren't Norse, really weren't Franks. They were Norsemen. They lived in Normandy. In any event, Alfred defeats the Vikings and he saves the Anglos. And that's why they call him the Great King, Alfred the Great. He's the only great king that England has, right? He was a great military man. After defeating the Vikings, he began to build up a navy, never heard of before on the island. And he began to try to unify all the people groups that were in the southern region, and even some of Northumbria. So he tries to organize and keep these groups together. He's now trying to organize this area to make it one nation, and that's his goal. So he's a great soldier. He's a great military man. He's also a great educator. One of the things that he does, him and his progeny, they also try to change the language. And so they're going to be going in and trying to educate people through the monasteries, okay? Now, before he actually gets involved in this, the Vikings also settled in the northern region, right? The areas between Scotland and England, that Northumbria region. And he lets them stay there. If they're not a problem, he keeps them out, right? But some of their language influence comes into England as well. So there's this mixing. The battle that Alfred was in lasted from 1872 to 1898. Again, he develops war strategies and ships for navies and a security system. He also wants to modify or unify everyone using a similar language, a single language. So he wants to develop an English standard. Okay, and he'll do this by teaching everybody, again, primarily through the monasteries, places of education where people can learn. They can learn about Old English. Now, again, Old English has a variety of cases and genders. So he's going to be trying to push this everywhere so that everybody's speaking the same language and they can become a stronger nation. Old English includes gender. We don't have much of that anymore. We don't have that at all, actually, in... I take that back. We do have it in a few suffixes. But by and large, we don't have that. We do have the word steward and the word stewardess, right? We have actor and actress. But we don't have it everywhere like they do in German or Spanish, where you have a feminine article and a male article for words, and just like suffixes. They also have a number of case markers. So they have a case marker for a subject. They have a case marker for the accusative, or the direct object. They have a case marker for possessive, a case marker for the dative, or the indirect object. Understand that we have direct object, indirect object, we have subjects and possessives, but we don't necessarily have specific markers or specific not specific articles for them as they did in Old English. But those are the types of things that were there. Those are the types of changes that were being made. He's trying to unify everybody under this standard. I want to talk more about the Benedictine reform. We're going to get to that next time. But just some thoughts, especially if you're going to be going into education and teaching. How does the political and the linguistic history here, how's that going to impact your teaching? When you look at England and you now see that it has a very rich history, all these different languages, all these different cultures that have interacted there for years, you also have to think, how does this impact your idea about English? I don't know about you, but when I first started learning about the history of English years ago, I thought, it was one language. It was always one language. And it wasn't. Even at the very beginning, we're seeing 5, 6, 7 different languages or dialects that are impacting one another. People from completely different cultures, from completely different countries, and yet they're merging all this language together. English is more like a hodgepodge of languages that have been put together to create this new language. We thank King Alfred for bringing some of this together. We, Benedictine, the Augustine, and the monks who came and brought the monastery. We should thank them as well. But how does all this information impact your idea about the English language? And lastly, why would this be important, or why would this be beneficial to you in your future? Just some thoughts to consider. The next little video that I make, we're going to cover these two here. The Benedictine Reform and the Conquests of Language and Transition. If you do have any questions, you can certainly give me a holler. Have a nice day now. Bye-bye.